September 14th, 2019, a courtroom erupted in chaos when a 19-year-old Maid's daughter stood up and revealed evidence the police had buried for months, evidence that could free an innocent man from death row. But how did a young woman with no legal training outsmart an entire police department and expose the truth they desperately tried to hide? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in Courtroom 7 of the Riverside County Superior Court as Judge Margaret Holloway adjusted her reading glasses. It was supposed to be a straightforward case, or at least that's what everyone believed when they walked through those heavy oak doors that September morning. Marcus Chen sat at the defendant's table, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the polished wood. At 32 years old, the software engineer had never imagined he'd be sitting here, accused of a crime that carried a sentence of 25 years to life. His public defender, an overworked attorney named Robert Fitzgerald, shuffled through papers with the resigned expression of someone who'd already accepted defeat. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. District Attorney Patricia Drummond stood with the confidence of someone who'd won 43 cases in a row, her reputation built on convictions that stuck. She'd laid out a timeline so precise, so damning, that even Marcus's own mother had begun to doubt him during the preliminary hearings. The crime in question had occurred on June 3rd, 2019, at the Grandview Estate, a sprawling mansion in the hills overlooking Riverside, where technology mogul Vincent Hargrove lived with his family. Someone had broken into Hargrove's private study and stolen over $2 million in bearer bonds, along with classified prototype designs for Hargrove's company, Nextech Industries. The theft had been executed with surgical precision during a charity gala when the house was full of guests. What made the case particularly damaging was the physical evidence. Police had found Marcus's fingerprints on the study's window frame. Security footage showed someone matching his build and height, entering through the garden entrance at 9:47 p.m. A witness, Hargrove's head of security, Derek Morrison, testified that he'd seen Marcus leaving the study area around 10:15 p.m., looking nervous and disheveled. But the most damning piece of evidence sat in a clear plastic bag on the prosecution's table. A Nextech Industries employee badge with Marcus's photo and identification number. It had been discovered in the bushes near the study window, partially buried in the soil. Marcus had worked at Nextech for 3 years as a mid-level developer. He'd attended the gala as part of the company team, invited like dozens of other employees. He'd had access to the grounds, opportunity to scope out security measures, and according to the prosecution, a motive, financial troubles stemming from his mother's medical bills. The evidence speaks for itself. Drummond had told the jury during opening statements. Marcus Chen had means, motive, and opportunity. The physical evidence places him at the crime scene during the exact window when the theft occurred. This isn't a case of circumstantial evidence piling up. This is a clear trail leading directly to one person. What nobody knew was that 13 miles away, in a cramped apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Riverside's east side, a young woman named Elena Vasquez was piecing together a very different story. Elena was 19 years old, with sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, and a mind that processed information like a computer analyzing data. She'd grown up watching her mother, Carmen Vasquez, work as a housekeeper at the Grandview Estate for the past 15 years. Carmen had scrubbed floors, polished silver, and organized closets in that mansion since Elena was 4 years old. The Vasquez apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in simultaneously, and a living room that doubled as Elena's study space. She'd graduated high school at the top of her class and had been accepted to UCLA with a full scholarship to study forensic science. But she'd deferred her admission for a year to help her mother. who'd been diagnosed with early-stage arthritis that made the physical demands of housekeeping increasingly painful. Elena had grown up in that mansion's shadow, literally and figuratively. As a child, she'd sometimes accompanied her mother to work during school breaks, sitting quietly in the staff quarters with her homework while Carmen cleaned. She'd memorized the layout of the Grandview estate by the time she was 12. Every hallway, every room, every hidden corner where the security cameras had blind spots. When news of the theft broke, Elena had followed the case obsessively. Something about the official narrative bothered her, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong space. She'd watched the preliminary hearings on the local news channel, taking notes in the margins of her spiral notebook. Her mother had been questioned by police as part of their investigation, standard procedure for all household staff. Carmen had told them the same thing she'd told Elena. Nothing had seemed unusual that night. She'd been working in the kitchen with the catering staff during the gala, preparing hors d'oeuvres and managing the service flow. But 3 weeks after the theft, Carmen had mentioned something to Elena during dinner, something she'd forgotten to tell the police because it had seemed insignificant at the time. "You know," Carmen had said, pushing rice around her plate, "I saw Mr. Morrison's brother that night, the one who was in prison. I didn't think anything of it because Derek said he was helping with security for the event. But when I saw him near the study hallway around 9:30, it struck me as odd. Why would extra security be inside the house during the party?" Elena had stopped mid-bite. "Derek Morrison's brother? The head of security has a brother?" "Oh yes, Thomas. He went to prison for fraud about 8 years ago. I remember because it was right after I started working at the estate." Derek was so embarrassed. "But I guess he's out now." Eleanor had immediately pulled out her laptop and started searching. Thomas Morrison, convicted in 2011 for securities fraud, released in March 2019, just 3 months before the theft. She'd found his mugshot, his criminal record, and several news articles about his case. He'd worked in finance before his conviction, specifically dealing with bearer bonds and investment securities. The coincidence was too significant to ignore. Elena had started building a timeline, cross-referencing everything she could find about the night of the theft. She'd requested public records from the court case, staying up until 3 a.m. reading through police reports and witness testimonies. And that's when she'd noticed it: the gaps in the investigation. Police had focused exclusively on Marcus Chen after finding his badge and fingerprints. They'd never followed up on other potential suspects. They'd never questioned why Marcus's badge would be so conveniently placed in the bushes, or why someone who'd carefully planned a sophisticated theft would make such a careless mistake. Elena had learned in her forensic science classes that real criminals rarely left such obvious trails. Either Marcus was the dumbest criminal in California, or someone had planted evidence to frame him. She'd spent weeks digging deeper, using every resource available to her. She'd talked to her mother's co-workers at the estate, asking casual questions about that night. She'd visited the public library to access newspaper archives and property records. She'd even created a fake social media profile to friend request people who'd attended the gala, looking for photos and videos that might show something the official investigation had missed. What she'd discovered had kept her awake at night, her mind racing with possibilities and implications. Now, as the trial entered its 3rd day, Elena sat in the back row of the courtroom gallery, a folder thick with documents resting on her lap. Her mother sat beside her, nervous and uncomfortable in these formal surroundings. Carmen had begged Elena not to get involved, warning her that challenging the police could bring trouble to their family. But Elena couldn't let it go. She'd watched Marcus Chen's face as the prosecution presented their case, and she'd seen something there that the jury apparently couldn't see: genuine confusion and fear. Not the calculated performance of a guilty man, but the raw terror of someone trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. Judge Holloway called the court to order after the lunch recess. District Attorney Drummond stood to call her next witness, a forensics expert who would testify about the fingerprint evidence. Elena's fingers tightened on her folder. She knew what she had to do, but the question was when. Interrupt now, and she'd likely be escorted out for contempt of court. Wait too long, and Marcus Chen might be convicted before she could present what she'd found. Her mother's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "Mia, are you sure about this?" Carmen whispered. Elena looked at Marcus Chen, then at the smug expression on Derek Morrison's face as he sat in the gallery near the front. The head of security had been present every day of the trial, watching the proceedings with the satisfaction of someone who believed justice was being served. "I'm sure, Mama," Elena whispered back. The truth matters more than staying quiet, she just had to wait for the right moment, the moment when her evidence would have maximum impact and couldn't be dismissed, or buried like it had been when she'd tried to bring it to the police department 3 weeks ago. That moment was coming. Elena could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. 3 weeks earlier, Elena had walked into the Riverside Police Department with her folder of documents, her heart pounding, but her resolve steady. The station smelled of burnt coffee and cleaning chemicals, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. She'd approached the front desk, where Officer Brandon Walsh sat scrolling through his phone, barely looking up when she cleared her throat. "I need to speak to someone about the Grandview estate theft case," Elena had said, trying to keep her voice confident despite the intimidating surroundings. Walsh had finally glanced up, taking in her worn jeans and UCLA sweatshirt with barely concealed disinterest. "The case is closed, miss. We arrested the perpetrator. Trial starts next month. That's exactly why I need to talk to someone. I have evidence that suggests you arrested the wrong person. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. That had gotten his attention, though not in the way Elena had hoped. His expression had shifted from boredom to annoyance. "Evidence? What kind of evidence?" "Timeline inconsistencies, witness statements that weren't followed up on, and information about someone else who had both opportunity and expertise to commit this crime." Walsh had sighed heavily, as if Elena were personally inconveniencing him. "Look, kid, we appreciate citizen involvement, but we have an entire forensics team and detective unit that worked this case. We found the perpetrator's fingerprints at the scene, his badge, and multiple witness identifications. Unless you have something that directly contradicts physical evidence, and I can't help you. I have a witness who places someone else near the study at the exact time of the theft, someone with a criminal record involving the exact type of items that were stolen." Walsh had stared at her for a long moment, then picked up his phone. "Let me see if Detective Reeves has a minute." 20 minutes later, Elena had found herself in a cramped interview room across from Detective Sarah Reeves, a woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a coffee-stained notepad. Reeves had at least listened, which was more than Walsh had done. Elena had laid out everything methodically. She'd explained about Thomas Morrison's presence at the estate that night, his criminal background in securities fraud, his expertise with bearer bonds. She'd presented a timeline showing that Marcus Chen had been verifiably in conversation with 3 other Nextech employees in the main ballroom between 9:45 and 10:20 p.m. Something multiple party attendees could confirm if anyone bothered to ask them. These people were never interviewed, Elena had pointed out, sliding photographs across the table. "I found these on social media. Look at the timestamps. Marcus is clearly visible in the background of this photo at 9:52 p.m. and this one at 10:08 p.m. Both were taken in the ballroom, which is on the opposite side of the mansion from Hargrove's study." Reeves had studied the photos, her expression unreadable. "Social media timestamps can be manipulated, then verify them with the original posters. Talk to these people." Elena had tapped the list of names she'd compiled. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to do the follow-up investigation that should have been done in the first place. The detective had leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Miss Vasquez, I understand you want to help, but you need to understand how investigations work. We follow the evidence. Chen's fingerprints were on that window frame. His badge was found at the scene. Security footage shows someone matching his description. Security footage shows someone wearing dark clothes, Eleanor had corrected. The quality is too poor to make a definitive identification. And fingerprints on a window frame? Marcus worked for the company. He'd been to the estate multiple times for company events. His fingerprints being somewhere in that house doesn't prove he committed the theft that specific night. What about the badge? What about it? If you were planning a sophisticated theft, would you drop your identification badge at the crime scene? Or would someone who wanted to frame you take your badge and plant it there? Reeves had been quiet for a moment, and Elena had allowed herself a flicker of hope. Maybe the detective was actually considering her points. Then Reeves had closed her notepad. Look, I appreciate the effort you've put into this. I really do. But we have a strong case, and the DA's office is confident in the prosecution. If there were any real holes in our investigation, the defense attorney would exploit them. The defense attorney is overworked and underfunded, Elena had shot back, frustration creeping into her voice. He's handling 17 other cases. He doesn't have the time or resources to dig this deep. That's not my problem. Reeves had stood up, signaling the conversation was over. If you're so convinced of Chen's innocence, take your information to his lawyer. But I'm warning you, don't interfere with an ongoing legal proceeding. That can get you in serious trouble. Elena had left the police station that day, feeling like she'd hit a brick wall. The system wasn't interested in truth. It was interested in closed cases and conviction rates, so she'd done exactly what Reeves suggested. She'd contacted Robert Fitzgerald, Marcus's public defender. Fitzgerald had agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near the courthouse, showing up 15 minutes late with circles under his eyes and a briefcase that looked like it had survived a war. He'd listened to her presentation with more attention than the police had given her, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. When she finished, he'd set down his pen and looked at her with something that might have been admiration mixed with pity. "This is good work," he'd said. "Really impressive for someone with no legal training. But here's the problem. I can't use most of this in court." Elena had felt her stomach drop. "Why not?" "The social media photos. Defense isn't required to prove innocence, so alibi evidence without sworn testimony is weak. These people you've identified, I'd have to track them down, convince them to testify, and prep them for cross-examination. That takes time I don't have. The information about Thomas Morrison, it's circumstantial. The prosecution would argue I'm trying to deflect blame without concrete evidence. But it creates reasonable doubt," Elena had insisted. "Maybe. But the physical evidence against Marcus is strong. A jury sees fingerprints and a badge, and they stop listening to alternative theories." Fitzgerald had taken a long sip of his coffee, grimacing at the taste. "The system is designed to favor the prosecution. They have unlimited resources, police investigators, forensic labs, expert witnesses. I have a paralegal who works 3 days a week and a copying budget that ran out last month. So, you're just going to let an innocent man go to prison?" "I'm going to do the best I can with what I have," Fitzgerald had said, and there was real pain in his voice. "But I need you to understand something. Even with everything you've found, the odds of winning this case are slim. The jury wants to believe the police did their job correctly. They want to trust that the system works, suggesting that detectives missed something or that evidence was planted. That's a hard sell." Elena had sat back in her chair, her mind racing. What if I could get proof? Not just circumstantial evidence, but actual proof that Thomas Morrison was involved. Then bring it to me and we'll talk. "But Elena," Fitzgerald had leaned forward, his expression serious. "Be careful. If you start poking around in this case too aggressively, you could put yourself in danger. If someone did frame Marcus, they're not going to appreciate you exposing them. That conversation had taken place 2 weeks ago. Since then, Elena had been even more determined to find the concrete evidence Fitzgerald needed. She'd started by researching Thomas Morrison more thoroughly. His prison record showed he'd been released 3 months before the theft, but his parole requirements meant he was supposed to report his employment and residence to his parole officer. Elena had filed a public records request for Thomas Morrison's parole documentation. What she'd received had been illuminating. According to his parole records, Thomas had listed his residence as Derek Morrison's address. He was living with his brother. His listed employment: security consultant for Grandview Estate. Derek had hired his convicted felon brother to work security at the same mansion he was supposed to be protecting. That alone raised red flags. But it got more interesting. Elena had cross-referenced the dates and discovered that Thomas had only started working at the estate in May 2019, just 1 month before the theft. And according to the employee records Carmen had quietly accessed for her, risking her own job in the process, Thomas had specifically requested to review the security system layouts and protocols as part of his training. He'd had a blueprint of every camera angle, every guard rotation, every blind spot in the security coverage. Elena had also discovered something else. Vincent Hargrove's bearer bonds and prototype designs were insured for their full value. The insurance company had paid out the claim within 6 weeks of the theft, a surprisingly fast turnaround that suggested minimal investigation on their part. And who had provided the security assessment for the insurance claim? Derek Morrison himself, verifying that all security measures had been properly in place and that the theft must have been an inside job by someone with authorized access. Someone exactly like Marcus Chen. The pieces were forming a picture, but Elena still needed the one element that would be undeniable in court. Direct evidence linking Thomas Morrison to the stolen items or the actual act of theft. That's when she'd remembered something her mother had mentioned in passing. The estate had an old-fashioned paper logbook in the security office, where anyone entering or exiting the property after hours had to sign in, separate from the electronic keycard system. It was a redundancy that Hargrove insisted on, a habit from his early days in business. If Thomas had been on the property that night, he would have had to sign that log. Elena had asked her mother to check the log during her next shift. Carmen had been terrified of getting caught, but she'd carefully photographed the pages from June 3rd with her phone, and there it was, Thomas Morrison's signature, logging in at 8:30 p.m. and logging out at 11:15 p.m. He'd been on the property during the exact window when the theft occurred. But when Elena cross-referenced this with the police reports, there was no mention of Thomas Morrison's presence that night. Derek had provided the police with a list of all security personnel on duty, and his brother's name wasn't on it. The log had been deliberately omitted from the evidence provided to investigators. Elena had felt a chill run down her spine when she'd realized what this meant. This wasn't just about framing Marcus Chen. This was about Derek Morrison actively covering up his brother's involvement and manipulating the police investigation. She'd brought this new evidence to Fitzgerald immediately. The lawyer had studied the photographs of the log entries, his expression growing more serious. "This is significant," he'd admitted. "But I need the original log, not just photos. Photos can be challenged as doctored. The original is in the security office at the estate." "How do we get it?" "We file a motion to compel evidence. I'll request the log as part of discovery, citing its relevance to establishing a timeline of all individuals present at the crime scene." Fitzgerald had actually smiled for the first time since she'd met him. If Derek refuses to produce it, or if it mysteriously disappeared, that itself becomes evidence of tampering. But the motion had been filed too late in the pretrial process. Judge Holloway had ruled that the defense should have requested this evidence earlier, and without a compelling reason to delay the trial, she'd denied the motion. They'd been blocked at every turn by procedure and timing, which brought Elena back to the present moment, sitting in the courtroom gallery. watching the trial proceed toward what seemed like an inevitable guilty verdict. The forensics expert droned on about fingerprint analysis methodology, showing enlarged images of Marcus's fingerprints alongside those lifted from the window frame. The jury members nodded along, looking convinced. Elena glanced down at her folder. Inside were copies of everything she'd found: the parole records, the log photos, the timeline, the social media evidence. Fitzgerald had said he'd try to introduce what he could during his defense presentation, but he'd warned her it might not be enough. The expert finished his testimony. Judge Holloway called for a 15-minute recess before the prosecution's next witness. As people stood and stretched, Elena watched Derek Morrison exit through the courtroom doors, pulling out his phone. Through the small window in the door, she could see him making a call, his expression tense. Something was happening. Elena could feel it, the same instinct that had driven her investigation from the beginning. She turned to her mother. "I'll be right back." Before Carmen could protest, Elena slipped out of the gallery and into the hallway, staying far enough back that Derek wouldn't notice her. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but every good investigator knew that people revealed the most when they thought no one was watching. Derek's voice carried in the quiet hallway, sharp and urgent. "I don't care what you have to do. Make sure nothing connects back to us. The trial's almost over. We just need to hold it together for a few more days." Elena's pulse quickened. She pulled out her phone and hit record, angling it carefully around the corner. This might be the break she'd been waiting for. Elena's hands trembled as she held her phone steady, capturing Derek Morrison's tense conversation. The courthouse hallway was mostly empty during the recess, with just a few attorneys huddled in quiet discussion at the far end. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to remain invisible while keeping her phone's microphone pointed toward Derek. "No, listen to me," Derek hissed into his phone, his back to Elena. "The Chen kid's lawyer is incompetent. He hasn't even scratched the surface. But if anyone starts asking questions about the security protocols from that night, we have a problem." There was a pause, as whoever was on the other end responded. "I don't care if you think it's paranoid. That Maid's daughter has been nosing around. Carmen's kid, the one who thinks she's some kind of detective." Derek's voice dropped lower, forcing Elena to strain to hear. She tried bringing something to the police a few weeks back. Reeves shut her down, but what if she doesn't let it go? Elena's breath caught. They knew about her visit to the police station. They'd been monitoring her attempts to investigate. "Just make sure the secondary files stay buried," Derek continued. "The ones showing the actual timeline. If those surface, we're done. Everything connects back to..." A door opened further down the hallway, and Derek immediately changed his tone. "Yeah, okay. I'll call you later about that security consultation, thanks." He ended the call abruptly and turned, his eyes scanning the hallway. Elena had already ducked into the women's restroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She locked herself in a stall and replayed the recording, her mind racing. Secondary files showing the actual timeline. What did that mean? Derek had access to the security system. Had he created false footage while hiding the real recordings? She needed to find those files, but breaking into the Grandview Estate's security office was beyond her capabilities. That would be actual breaking and entering, the kind of thing that would destroy any credibility she had and possibly land her in jail. Think, Elena. There has to be another way. She waited 5 minutes before emerging from the restroom. The hallway had filled again as people returned from recess. Elena spotted her mother looking worried near the courtroom entrance. "Mia, where did you go?" Carmen whispered urgently. "I was worried. I'm fine, Mama, but I need to ask you something." Elena guided her mother to a quieter corner. "The security footage from the estate, where is it stored?" "Mr. Morrison keeps everything on a server in his office." "But Elena, you can't..." "I'm not going to break in," Elena assured her. "But the footage that was given to the police, do you know if Derek handed that over personally, or did the police get it directly from the system?" Carmen thought for a moment. "He gave it to them himself. I remember because he spent a whole day in his office preparing the files. He said he wanted to make sure everything was organized properly for the investigation. That was it." Derek had curated what the police saw. He cherry-picked footage that supported the narrative against Marcus while hiding anything that might contradict it or implicate his brother. Does the security system back up to cloud storage? Elena asked. I don't know about computers and clouds, Mika, but I know Mr. Hargrove is very particular about data security. He makes Derek keep multiple copies of everything. He's paranoid about losing important records. Multiple copies. That meant somewhere there might be unedited footage that Derek hadn't been able to completely erase. Elena's mind flashed back to something she'd read in her forensic science coursework. Digital forensics experts could often recover deleted files or find backups that people thought they'd erased. But she didn't have access to that kind of expertise, and even if she did, she'd need legal authorization to examine the Grandview Estate's security system, unless... Mama, you said Mr. Hargrove is paranoid about data security, right? Does he ever review the footage himself? Sometimes. He has access to everything from his home computer. He checks it occasionally when he travels to make sure the house is secure. Elena's pulse quickened. Vincent Hargrove wasn't part of the conspiracy. He was the victim. If she could somehow get information to him about the manipulated evidence, he might grant access to the full, unedited security archives. But approaching Hargrove directly was risky. He was a powerful man who'd already seen someone arrested for stealing from him. Why would he believe a 19-year-old maid's daughter over his head of security? She needed more than just a word. She needed something concrete that would make Hargrove question the official narrative. The bailiff's voice echoed through the hallway. Court is back in session. All parties please return to the courtroom. Elena and Carmen made their way back to their seats in the gallery. As they settled in, Elena noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. Sitting 3 rows ahead of them was a woman in an expensive navy suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. She was taking notes on a tablet, her expression focused and analytical. Elena leaned toward an elderly man sitting next to her who'd been present every day of the trial. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Do you know who that woman is? The blonde in the navy suit." The man glanced over. "That's Jennifer Kaplan. She's a reporter for the Riverside Tribune. Been covering this trial from day one. A reporter. Someone whose job was to investigate and expose the truth. Judge Holloway called the court to order, and the prosecution called their next witness. Vincent Hargrove himself, the tech mogul, took the stand with the bearing of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms. He was in his late 50s, with silver-gray hair and sharp features that radiated intelligence. As he was sworn in, Elena studied him carefully, trying to assess what kind of man he was beyond his wealth and status. District Attorney Drummond approached with a sympathetic smile. "Mr. Hargrove, thank you for being here today. I know this has been a difficult experience for you." "It has," Hargrove agreed, his voice measured. "When you welcome someone into your home, into your company, you expect a certain level of trust. To have that violated is deeply disturbing. Can you describe what was taken from your study on the night of June 3rd? $2 million in bearer bonds that I keep for emergency liquidity, and prototype designs for our next-generation quantum encryption chip. Those designs represent 5 years of research and development. In the wrong hands, they could compromise national security. We have contracts with the Department of Defense." A murmur ran through the courtroom. This was the first time the national security angle had been emphasized so dramatically. "And did you know the defendant, Marcus Chen?" Drummond continued. "I knew of him. He was one of several hundred employees at Nextech. We'd never had a personal interaction that I can recall. He was invited to the gala as part of the development team. Did he have authorized access to your private study?" "Absolutely not. That area was off-limits to all guests. Only family and essential security personnel were permitted in that wing of the house during the event." Drummond nodded gravely. "Mr. Hargrove, when you discovered the theft, what was your immediate reaction?" "Shock initially, then anger, then a determination to see justice served. I immediately contacted Derek Morrison, my head of security, and we called the police. Derek and his team were incredibly professional in securing the scene and providing investigators with everything they needed. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Of course, Hargrove would praise Derek. He had no idea his trusted security chief was the actual architect of the crime. No further questions. "Your Honor," Drummond said, returning to her table with evident satisfaction. Robert Fitzgerald stood for cross-examination, looking like he was already anticipating defeat. "Mr. Hargrove, you mentioned that only essential security personnel were allowed in the study wing. Can you provide a list of who that included?" "Derek Morrison and his 2 assistant security managers, Keith Reynolds and Paul Yamamoto, not including any additional security hired specifically for the event?" Hargrove paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "I believe Derek brought in some additional personnel for the evening. I didn't review the specific roster. I trusted his judgment on security matters. So there could have been people in that wing whom you didn't personally authorize?" "Derek's authorizations are my authorizations. I trust him implicitly. He's worked for me for 12 years, Fitzgerald pressed on. "Mr. Hargrove, when the police provided you with the security footage, did you review it yourself?" "Derek walked me through the relevant portions. As I said, I trust his expertise in these matters, but you didn't independently review the full footage from that evening." "I saw what was relevant to the investigation." "What was relevant," Fitzgerald repeated, "as determined by Derek Morrison." "Objection," Drummond stood. "Counsel is badgering the witness and implying facts not in evidence." "Sustained," Judge Holloway ruled. "Mr. Fitzgerald, please confine yourself to questions." Fitzgerald tried a different approach. "Mr. Hargrove, does your security system maintain backup copies of all footage?" "Yes. Derek maintains a comprehensive archive. It's company policy. And who has access to that archive?" "Derek manages all security data. I have administrative access, but I rarely need to use it. That's why I employ a security professional. So theoretically, if someone wanted to alter or delete portions of the security footage, they would need Derek Morrison's access credentials." "Objection!" Drummond was on her feet again. "Speculation and argumentative." Sustained. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I'm warning you, no further questions, Your Honor." Fitzgerald sat down, having planted the seed of doubt, but knowing he hadn't hit hard enough to crack Hargrove's confidence in his security chief. As Hargrove stepped down from the witness stand, Eleanor made a decision. She pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message, then held it up for the reporter Jennifer Kaplan to see. The message read, "I have evidence that the security footage was manipulated. The wrong man is on trial. Can we talk after court?" Kaplan's eyes widened as she read the message. She glanced at Elena, then gave a subtle nod before turning back to face the front of the courtroom. The prosecution rested its case. Judge Holloway announced that the defense would begin presenting its case the following morning, then adjourned for the day. As people filed out of the courtroom, Elena intercepted Jennifer Kaplan in the hallway. "I'm Elena Vasquez," she said quickly, aware that time was limited. "My mother works at the Grandview estate. I've been investigating this case independently, and I found evidence that suggests Marcus Chen was framed." Kaplan studied her with the sharp assessment of a seasoned journalist. "That's a serious accusation. What kind of evidence?" Elena glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then pulled out her folder. "Timeline inconsistencies, witness statements that were never followed up, and information about Derek Morrison's brother, Thomas, a convicted securities fraud expert who was present at the estate the night of the theft, but whose presence was omitted from the police reports." The reporter's eyes sharpened with interest. "Do you have documentation? Copies of parole records, security log photographs, social media evidence placing Marcus Chen in a different location during the theft, and a recording I made today of Derek Morrison on the phone discussing secondary files and the actual timeline." Kaplan pulled out her own phone. "Send me everything. If even half of this checks out, it's a major story. But I need to verify independently before I can publish anything. You understand that?" "I understand. I just want the truth to come out. Give me your contact information." I'll review everything tonight and reach out tomorrow. Kaplan paused, her expression serious. If what you're saying is true, you've potentially uncovered evidence tampering by law enforcement or their sources. That's explosive. But it also means you need to be careful. People don't like it when their narratives get challenged, especially when they're this far into a trial. Elena felt a chill at the warning, but nodded. I know, I'm careful. As Kaplan walked away with Elena's information, Carmen approached, looking worried. Mia, what are you doing? Talking to reporters? This is getting dangerous. Mama, an innocent man is about to go to prison. We can't just stand by and let it happen. But what about us? If Mr. Morrison finds out you're investigating him, I could lose my job. We could lose everything. Eleanor took her mother's hands. I know you're scared, I am too. But you taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's what I'm doing. Carmen's eyes filled with tears, but she squeezed her daughter's hands. You are so much braver than I ever was. I learned from the best, Elena said softly. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, replaying everything in her mind, looking for the pieces she might have missed. Derek Morrison had orchestrated the entire frame-up, but why? Was it just to help his brother commit the theft, or was there something deeper? She grabbed her laptop and started searching again, this time focusing on Derek Morrison's finances. If he and his brother had stolen $2 million in bearer bonds, there should be some trace of unusual wealth or spending. What she found instead was debt. Derek had significant credit card balances, 2 mortgages, and according to public records, he'd declared bankruptcy 7 years ago. For someone working as head of security at a wealthy estate, he seemed to be living well beyond his means. Then she found it. A property record showing that Derek had recently purchased a vacation home in Lake Tahoe for $850,000. The purchase date was July 15th, 2019, just 6 weeks after the theft. Where had Derek Morrison gotten $850,000 in cash? Elena screenshot everything, her hands shaking with excitement. This was it, the financial connection that proved Derek had profited from the crime. She immediately emailed the information to Jennifer Kaplan with a subject line, financial records showing suspicious purchase after theft. As she hit send, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. The text message read, "Stop digging, or you and your mother will regret it." Elena stared at the screen, her blood running cold. Someone was watching her. Someone knew exactly what she was doing, and they were threatening her family. But instead of fear paralyzing her, Elena felt something else, determination hardening into steel. They'd shown their hand by threatening her. That meant she was close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. She took a screenshot of the threatening text and forwarded it to Kaplan, then to Fitzgerald with a simple message. They're scared. That means we're on the right track. Tomorrow the defense would present its case. And somehow, Elena needed to find a way to get her evidence in front of that jury before it was too late for Marcus Chen, and possibly for her and her mother as well. The truth was dangerous, but silence was even more dangerous. Elena had crossed the point of no return, and now she had to see this through to the end, whatever that might be. September 14th, 2019. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Elena arrived with her mother, both of them exhausted from a sleepless night. Elena's phone had buzzed twice more with threatening messages, each one more explicit than the last. She'd forwarded them all to Kaplan and Fitzgerald, building a digital trail in case anything happened to her. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere felt different. There was electricity in the air that hadn't been there before. Elena noticed it immediately. Jennifer Kaplan wasn't sitting in her usual spot. Instead, she was standing near the prosecution's table, speaking intensely with District Attorney Drummond, showing her something on her tablet. Drummond's face had gone pale. Elena's heart leaped. Kaplan had found something. As people settled into their seats, Elena noticed Derek Morrison enter through the back door. His usual confident demeanor had cracked slightly. There was tension in his shoulders, and his eyes darted around the courtroom nervously. When his gaze landed on Elena, Something cold flashed across his face before he looked away. Judge Holloway entered, and everyone rose. As they sat back down, the judge addressed the court with an unusual preface. Before we proceed with the defense's case, I need to address a matter that has come to my attention this morning. She looked at Drummond. Madam District Attorney, I understand you have a motion? Drummond stood, and for the first time since the trial began, she looked shaken. Your Honor, new evidence has surfaced that requires immediate review. I'm requesting a recess to investigate information provided by the Riverside Tribune that may be material to this case. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Order! Miss Drummond, what is the nature of this evidence? Your Honor, I'd prefer to discuss this in chambers. No, the voice came from the gallery. Everyone turned to see Elena standing, her folder clutched in her hands. This needs to be public. The people deserve to know what was hidden from them. Young lady, sit down immediately, Judge Holloway commanded. You are not recognized by this court. Then recognize me, Elena said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. My name is Elena Vasquez. My mother works at the Grandview estate. I've spent 3 months investigating this case because I knew something was wrong. The police ignored crucial evidence. The prosecution built their case on manipulated security footage. And the real criminals are in this courtroom right now, but they're not sitting at the defendant's table. The courtroom exploded with noise. Judge Holloway banged her gavel repeatedly. Order! Ms. Vasquez, you are in contempt. Let her speak. This time it was Vincent Hargrove who stood, his face ashen. If there's evidence that was hidden from me, from the court, I want to hear it. Now. Judge Holloway looked between Hargrove, the standing Eleanor, and the pale-faced Drummond. After a long moment, she made a decision. Bailiff, ensure Ms. Vasquez doesn't leave. Mr. Fitzgerald, approach the bench. The public defender looked stunned, but moved quickly. Judge Holloway spoke quietly with him and Drummond for several minutes, while the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Elena remained standing, her mother gripping her hand tightly. Finally, Judge Holloway returned her attention to the courtroom. In light of potentially exculpatory evidence that was not disclosed during discovery, I'm calling an emergency evidentiary hearing. Ms. Vasquez, approach the bench. Elena's legs felt like water, but she walked forward, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom on her. Derek Morrison had half risen from his seat, his face twisted with barely controlled rage. Judge Holloway's expression was severe. Ms. Vasquez, you have made serious accusations about evidence tampering and police misconduct. If you cannot substantiate these claims, you will face charges for contempt and potentially obstruction of justice. Do you understand? I understand, Your Honor, and I can prove everything I've said. Then proceed. And I warn everyone in this courtroom, anyone who attempts to leave before I dismiss this hearing will be held in contempt. Elena noticed Derek Morrison freeze as he'd been edging toward the door. The bailiff moved to block the exit. Elena opened her folder with shaking hands. Your Honor, on June 3rd, 2019, the night of the theft, the police were provided with security footage that appeared to show Marcus Chen near the study where the theft occurred. But that footage was selectively edited by Derek Morrison, head of security at the Grandview estate, to hide the presence of his brother, Thomas Morrison. She pulled out the first document. Thomas Morrison is a convicted felon who served 8 years for securities fraud involving bearer bonds, the exact items stolen that night. He was released from prison 3 months before the theft. According to his parole records, he was living with his brother Derek and working as a security consultant at the Grandview estate. Hargrove was now standing again, his face darkening with anger. Derek, is this true? Your brother was working at my estate? Derek's jaw clenched. Vincent, I can explain. Silence. Judge Holloway commanded. Ms. Vasquez, continue. Elena held up her phone. This is a photograph of the security logbook from the Grandview estate, showing Thomas Morrison signing in at 8:30 p.m. on June 3rd and signing out at 11:15 p.m. This log was never provided to the police. When I brought this evidence to Detective Sarah Reeves 3 weeks ago, she dismissed it and refused to investigate further. She pulled out more documents. Here are social media photographs with verified timestamps showing Marcus Chen in the main ballroom between 9:45 and 10:20 p.m., the exact time window when the theft occurred. These witnesses were never interviewed by police. Additionally, Eleanor continued, her confidence growing, Derek Morrison purchased an $850,000 vacation home in Lake Tahoe 6 weeks after the theft, despite having declared bankruptcy 7 years ago and carrying significant debt. Where did that money come from? Drummond had her head in her hands. Hargrove looked like he might have a stroke. But the most damning evidence, Elena said, pulling out her phone again, is this recording I made yesterday of Derek Morrison in this courthouse hallway, discussing secondary files and the actual timeline that needed to stay buried. She played the recording. Derek's voice filled the courtroom, discussing cover-ups and mentioning Eleanor by name, warning about what would happen if the secondary files showing the actual timeline were discovered. The courtroom was silent, except for the recording. When it ended, Judge Holloway turned to Derek Morrison with fury in her eyes. Mr. Morrison, stand up. Derek stood slowly, his face drained of color. Bailiff, take Mr. Morrison into custody on suspicion of evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. Ms. Drummond, I assume you'll be filing additional charges. As the bailiff moved toward Derek, he suddenly bolted for the side door. But Vincent Hargrove, surprisingly agile for a man his age, stepped into his path. You worked for me for 12 years, Hargrove said, his voice shaking with rage. I trusted you with everything. You violated that trust, destroyed a young man's life, and stole from me. Why? Derek's composure finally shattered. Because you have everything. You sit in your mansion making millions, while people like me break our backs for scraps. Thomas and I saw an opportunity, and we took it. We deserved that money more than you did. So you framed an innocent man? Hargrove's voice was ice. You destroyed Marcus Chen's life because you felt entitled to my property. The bailiff grabbed Derek's arms, pulling them behind his back. As handcuffs clicked into place, Derek's eyes found Elena in the crowd. You should have stayed quiet, little girl. You have no idea what you've done. I've done what you were too cowardly to do, Elena shot back. I told the truth. Judge Holloway banged her gavel. Remove Mr. Morrison from my courtroom. Miss Drummond, I want arrest warrants issued immediately for Thomas Morrison as well. Mr. Hargrove, I need you to provide this court with complete, unedited access to your security system archives. You'll have it within the hour, Hargrove promised. The judge turned to Marcus Chen, who had been sitting in stunned silence throughout the entire revelation. Mr. Chen, I cannot formally dismiss the charges against you until the district attorney's office has completed its investigation of this new evidence. However, I'm releasing you on your own recognizance immediately. I apologize on behalf of this court for the miscarriage of justice you have endured. Marcus stood on shaky legs, tears streaming down his face. His mother, sitting in the gallery, let out a sob of relief. Judge Holloway addressed the entire courtroom. Let this be a lesson to everyone present. Justice requires diligence, skepticism, and the courage to question authority when something doesn't add up. Ms. Vasquez, she looked at Eleanor with something approaching respect. Your actions today, while technically contemptuous of court procedure, have potentially prevented an innocent man from spending decades in prison. The court recognizes your service to justice. As the hearing was adjourned, chaos erupted. Reporters swarmed Elena, shouting questions. Jennifer Kaplan pushed through the crowd, her camera crew in tow. Elena, what made you keep investigating when the police told you to stop? Kaplan asked. Because the truth matters more than convenience, Elena answered. Because Marcus Chen deserves someone to fight for him. And because my mother taught me that staying silent in the face of injustice makes you complicit in it. Carmen was crying now, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. You did it, Mika. You actually did it. Marcus Chen approached them, his public defender at his side. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said to Elena, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life. Literally saved my life. You don't need to thank me," Elena said. "You just need to go live the life you were supposed to have. Go be free." As the crowds dispersed and the courthouse began to empty, Elena stood with her mother, watching the sun stream through the tall windows. She thought about the threatening texts on her phone, about the sleepless nights, about the moments when she'd wanted to give up because fighting seemed too hard and too dangerous, but she'd done it anyway, because some things were worth the risk. 3 weeks later, the full story broke. The Riverside Tribune's investigation, led by Jennifer Kaplan and built on Elena's foundation of evidence, uncovered the entire conspiracy. Thomas Morrison was arrested attempting to board a flight to Mexico. The unedited security footage from the Grandview estate showed Thomas entering and exiting the study during the theft. With Derek providing cover and misdirection, all charges against Marcus Chen were formally dismissed. He received a public apology from the Riverside Police Department and the District Attorney's Office. Detective Sarah Reeves was placed on administrative leave for failing to follow up on Elena's evidence. Derek Morrison was charged with conspiracy to commit theft, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact. Thomas Morrison faced charges for the actual theft, along with parole violations. Both brothers eventually pleaded guilty to avoid trial, receiving sentences of 15 and 20 years. Respectively. Vincent Hargrove personally established a $50,000 scholarship fund in Elena's name for students pursuing careers in forensic science and criminal justice. He also hired a new head of security, with much more rigorous background checks this time. Elena deferred her UCLA admission 1 more year, but this time it was to work as a consultant for the California Innocence Project, helping investigate other cases where evidence might have been overlooked or manipulated. She'd found her calling not just in forensic science, but in fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Carmen kept her job at the Grandview estate, where Hargrove gave her a substantial raise and his personal apology for the danger his former employee had put her family in. And Marcus Chen, he returned to Nextech Industries, eventually becoming a senior developer. But he never forgot the 19-year-old woman who refused to let an injustice stand unchallenged. Sometimes the system works, but sometimes it takes one person with enough courage to look closer, dig deeper, and refuse to accept the easy answers, to make sure it does. Elena Vasquez had been that person. And in doing so, she'd reminded an entire city that justice isn't just about the law. It's about the truth, no matter how hard it is to find or how dangerous it is to speak, because in the end, the truth always matters. And someone has to be brave enough to fight for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.